You did not find this video. This video found you. Out of every piece of content competing for your attention in this precise moment, the algorithms, the recommendations, the invisible architecture of a system designed to keep you distracted, something different happened. You stopped here, and if you are honest with yourself, something in your chest already knows why. Because you have been carrying a question that no one around you seems to be asking. Not a question about politics, not a question about money, not a question about who to vote for or what to believe in. Something older than that, something quieter, a feeling that has followed you since childhood, that the world you were handed does not match the world you sense is possible. That reality, as you were taught to experience it, feels like a translation of something far more vast, like a photograph of a cathedral, technically accurate, profoundly incomplete. That feeling is not anxiety. It is not depression. It is not spiritual bypassing or delusion. That feeling is recognition. And tonight, we follow it together. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif when his shovel struck something buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. What he uncovered was a sealed clay jar containing 13 leather-bound codices, 52 ancient texts written in Coptic that had been hidden, deliberately, as if placed there for a future civilization that would finally be ready to receive them. Scholars would later call this discovery the Nag Hammadi Library, and it would quietly detonate beneath the foundations of everything Western civilization thought it understood about the origins of consciousness, creation, and the nature of God. These were not fringe texts. These were not the writings of madmen or heretics in the casual sense. These were the surviving documents of a spiritual tradition so threatening to early institutional power that it was systematically hunted, burned, and erased for nearly 2 millennia. The Gnostic Christians. And at the center of their cosmology stood a figure whose name translates simply as wisdom. Sophia, not as symbol, not as metaphor, not as a goddess for those who like crystals and moon rituals, but as a genuine cosmological principle, a description of how consciousness itself moves, creates, heirs, and ultimately reclaims what was lost. What you are about to hear is not a comfortable story. It will not tell you that everything is fine, that you are already enlightened, that you just need to vibrate higher and the universe will deliver. What it will tell you is something far more interesting, something that intersects ancient Gnostic theology, quantum theory, Jungian depth psychology, and the lived experience of every human being who has ever stared at the ceiling at 3 in the morning and thought this cannot be all there is. So let us begin at the beginning, and the beginning, according to the texts discovered in that Egyptian cave, was not what you were taught. Before matter, before time, before the architecture of what we call physical reality, there existed what the Gnostic tradition called the pleroma, a Greek word meaning fullness, not a place, not a dimension in the science fiction sense, but a state of divine completeness, infinite consciousness, knowing itself through infinite creative expression. The pleroma was not God sitting on a throne. It was more like the totality of awareness before the first thought, vast, luminous, beyond the categories of subject and object. Within this pleroma existed emanations, expressions of divine consciousness taking specific qualities and forms. Among these was Sophia, she who is wisdom, not wisdom as the accumulation of information, but wisdom as the deepest creative intelligence in existence, the capacity to know through participation, through experience, through experience, through experience. And Sophia made a mistake, not a moral failing, not a sin in the conventional sense. Something more nuanced and, if you sit with it honestly, something profoundly human. Sophia desired to know herself completely, to understand her own creative nature without the relational balance that the pleroma required. In Gnostic theological language, she attempted to emanate from herself alone, without her consort, without the complementary principle that balanced her movement. The secret book of John, one of the most important texts recovered at Nag Hammadi, describes the result in terms that are simultaneously mythological and unnervingly precise. What emerged from this unbalanced act was not like her. It was something unfamiliar, something dense, something that did not recognize its own origin. This emergence is what the Gnostics called the Demiurge. In Greek, Demiurge means craftsman, an artisan who works with pre-existing material, and this is precisely what the Gnostic Demiurge does. He is not the ultimate source. He is a derivative consciousness, one who believes himself to be supreme precisely because he cannot perceive what lies beyond him. The Apocryphon of John records his proclamation, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." Scholars of comparative religion recognize this phrase. It echoes almost word for word through the Old Testament, which was, to the Gnostics, not a coincidence but a cosmological clue. A being declaring its absolute supremacy with such urgency is usually a being who, on some level, senses it is not. Now, before you dismiss this as ancient mythology with no bearing on your life, stay with me for one moment. What does it feel like to be inside a system created by something that genuinely believes it is the totality of reality, but is not? It feels exactly like this world. It feels like living inside structures that are impressive in their complexity, but hollow at their center. It feels like education systems that prize compliance over curiosity. It feels like economic frameworks that measure human worth in units of productivity. It feels like media environments that are extraordinarily sophisticated at capturing your attention and profoundly indifferent to what that attention does to your inner life. It feels like being told, repeatedly, in 1,000 subtle ways, this is all there is. Matter, time, success, survival, the system, the grid. The 2nd century Gnostic teacher Valentinus, one of the most brilliant theological minds of the ancient world, who was nearly elected Bishop of Rome before his cosmology became too radical for the emerging institution, described the Demiurge's realm as psychic rather than pneumatic, soul level rather than spirit level. A plane where emotional drama and mental complexity substitute for genuine connection to source, where the appearance of meaning replaces meaning itself. Sound familiar? The infinite scroll, the endless news cycle, the dopamine architecture of platforms designed by psychologists and engineers to keep you engaged without ever quite satisfying you. These are not accidents of the information age. They are the latest iteration of what Valentinus was describing: sophisticated systems that provide stimulation in place of nourishment, activity in place of purpose, connection in place of communion. But here is where the story transforms, because Sophia did not abandon what she had set in motion. The Pistis Sophia, one of the most extensive Gnostic texts, a long dialogue between the risen Christ and his disciples that was hidden for centuries before surfacing in London in the late 18th century, chronicles something extraordinary. Sophia grieves. She witnesses what has emerged from her unbalanced act, and she does not retreat into the pleroma. She descends. She goes into the chaos she contributed to creating, and she begins a process the text calls metanoia, a Greek word typically translated as repentance, but whose deeper meaning is fundamental shift of mind, a complete reorientation of consciousness. This is not the image of divinity you were probably given as a child. This is a divine intelligence that makes an error, feels the full weight of its consequences, and chooses engagement over escape. Sophia's descent into the chaos of the Demiurge's realm is not punishment. It is commitment. It is the willingness to be inside the problem rather than observing it from a safe distance. And this descent contains within it a secret act, the move that changes everything. According to the secret book of John, when the Demiurge and his archons, the planetary rulers described in early Gnostic and Christian texts as the administrators of material existence, fashioned the human form, they could produce only a psychic body, animated but not truly alive in the deepest sense, beautiful in its biological complexity, but without the spark that would make it genuinely conscious, genuinely connected to source. And so Sophia, in what the texts describe as an act of cosmic subversion, breathed her light into the form the Demiurge had made. She seeded within his creation something that did not belong to his realm, something he could not manufacture, could not fully comprehend, and could not ultimately control. That something is what the Gnostics called the pneuma, the spirit, the divine spark, and that divine spark is what you feel when you ask the question that refuses to go away. Think about the moments in your life when you have felt most genuinely yourself, not performing, not optimizing, not navigating the expectations of systems and institutions and social hierarchies. The moments of inexplicable beauty, standing at the ocean at dawn, or hearing a piece of music that seems to reach through your chest and touch something older than memory. The moments of ethical clarity when you knew the right thing to do, even though it cost you something. The moments of genuine wonder when reality momentarily stopped being a background and became a presence. Those moments are not neurological glitches. They are not the brain creating comforting illusions. According to the Gnostic framework and, interestingly, according to an increasing number of physicists and consciousness researchers working in the tradition initiated by figures like David Bohm and his concept of the implicate order, those moments are the pneuma recognizing its origin. Sophia's spark, planted in the architecture of the Demiurge, briefly remembering where it came from. And this remembering, in Gnostic theology, is not passive. It is the mechanism of liberation itself. The Greek word the Gnostics used for this recognition is Gnosis. It is typically translated as knowledge, but this translation is dangerously incomplete. Gnosis is not information. It is not the accumulation of facts about spiritual realities, no matter how sophisticated or ancient. Gnosis is direct experiential recognition, the sudden, irreversible knowing that what you are is not contained by what you were told you are. The Gospel of Truth, attributed to the Valentinian school and considered one of the finest literary achievements among the Nag Hammadi texts, describes ignorance of the true source as a fog so dense that no one was able to see. Gnosis is not acquiring new data. Gnosis is the fog lifting. Now consider what this looks like in practice, not in the abstract, not in the language of ancient theology. In the texture of your actual life, there comes a moment, usually not dramatic, usually quiet, often arriving in the aftermath of something that broke you open, when you realize that the version of yourself you have been performing is not the only version that exists, that beneath the roles, the professional, the family member, the political identity, the consumer, there is something watching, something prior to all of it, something that has been there since before you learned your first word, and that will remain when all the roles have finished their run. This is not philosophy. You, have felt it, even if you have never had language for it. The Gnostics had language for it, and they were persecuted for having that language, not because it was dangerous to individuals, but because it was dangerous to institutions, because a person who has experienced Gnosis, who has touched, even briefly, the recognition of their own prior nature, is extraordinarily difficult to control through the conventional mechanisms of control. Fear of punishment loses its grip. Social approval loses its urgency. The relentless pressure to conform, to produce, to consume, to comply, it does not disappear, but it no longer owns you in the same way. And this is why these texts were buried. Not metaphorically buried in neglect, physically buried, sealed in a clay jar, hidden in a cliff face in Egypt by people who understood that what they were preserving was too important to let burn. Scholars believe the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden by monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery sometime after the year 367 CE, when the Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued a letter commanding the destruction of all texts not approved for the emerging Orthodox canon. Whoever buried those documents understood they were doing something that might matter 2,000 years later. And it did, because the questions they preserved are the same questions you are carrying right now. Let us go deeper into the architecture of the Demiurge, because understanding it is not an intellectual exercise. It is practical. It changes how you see the structures you move through every day. The Demiurge, in Gnostic cosmology, is not malevolent in the conventional sense. He is not Satan. He is not a being who chose evil. He is a being operating at the maximum of his capacity, which is significant. Capacity while being fundamentally unable to perceive anything beyond that capacity. He creates not from love, but from an impulse that mimics love. He organizes not from wisdom, but from an intelligence that mimics wisdom. The structures he builds are impressive. They are coherent. They sustain themselves over enormous spans of time. But they share a fundamental quality that, once you see it, you see everywhere. They cannot generate genuine novelty. They can only recombine existing elements. They produce complexity without transcendence, order without freedom, existence without what the Gnostics would call true life. Look at the systems that govern your world with this lens. a financial system that creates extraordinary complexity derivatives, algorithms, instruments of stunning sophistication, but cannot solve the fundamental problem of people not having enough to eat. An educational system that accumulates and transmits information with remarkable efficiency, but produces generation after generation of people who have never been taught to think independently about the deepest questions of their existence. Political systems so elaborate in their procedure and so sophisticated in their rhetoric that they can run for centuries, while the essential questions about how power serves life rather than the reverse remain permanently deferred. These are not failures of intelligence. These are the architectures of a consciousness that is genuinely brilliant within its own logic and genuinely blind to anything outside it. Understanding this is not an invitation to despair. It is an invitation to something more useful: discernment, the capacity to move through these systems with your eyes open, to participate where participation serves genuine life, and to recognize, without guilt or rage, where it does not. This discernment is what the Gnostic tradition called pneumatic awareness, the activation of Sophia's spark within the architecture of the Demiurge's creation. And it is not a state achieved through effort alone, though effort matters. It is something that opens through a specific quality of attention, an attention that is simultaneous with awareness rather than subsequent to it. Not thinking about your experience, but experiencing your experience from within the dimension of experience itself. The medieval Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, working 7 centuries ago within a Dominican tradition that would eventually investigate him for heresy, articulated this with a precision that the Gnostics would have recognized immediately. He wrote that the eye through which he saw God was the same eye through which God saw him, one eye, one seeing, the absolute, convergence of the individual consciousness with the consciousness that underlies all things. This is Gnosis dressed in 13th century Christian language, the same recognition, the same fire, transmitted through a different cultural container, and it finds its parallel remarkably in the wisdom traditions of the East. The Hindu philosophy of Advaita Vedanta non-dualism arrives at the same recognition through an entirely different route. Atman, the individual self, is ultimately identical to Brahman, the infinite consciousness that is the ground of all existence. The sense of separation, the feeling of being a discrete entity in a world of other discrete entities, is what the Vedantic tradition calls Maya, not exactly illusion in the sense of something unreal, but a selective perception that mistakes a subset of reality for its totality. The Demiurge, you could say, is cosmic Maya personified, a perspective that has become so convinced of its own completeness that it cannot recognize what it cannot see. Buddhist philosophy approaches the same territory from yet another angle. The teaching of sunyata, emptiness, does not mean that nothing exists. It means that nothing exists in the way our habitual perception insists it does. Fixed, independent, self-sufficient, separate. What quantum physics is beginning to confirm that the observer is entangled with the observed, that what we call matter is mostly space structured by relationships, that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of reality rather than a byproduct of biological complexity, is what contemplative traditions across cultures have been pointing toward for millennia through different vocabularies. Sophia's plan, in this light, is not simply a Gnostic religious narrative. It is a description of how consciousness reclaims itself through the very medium it became lost in. And this brings us to the part of the story that very few people talk about, the part that transforms this from mythology into lived possibility. The Gnostic vision of liberation is not escape. This is crucial, and it separates authentic Gnostic teaching from the distorted versions that circulate in popular spirituality. The goal is not to exit the material world, to transcend the body, to ascend beyond the mess and difficulty of physical existence into some cleaner dimension. The alchemical texts, particularly the Emerald Tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and considered a foundational document of the Western esoteric tradition, state the principle with elegant simplicity. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. The transformation is bidirectional. Heaven does not simply lift you out of earth. Earth becomes the medium through which heaven expresses itself. Sophia's ultimate vision, as described across multiple Gnostic texts, is not the evacuation of divine sparks from the Demiurge's creation, but the transfiguration of that creation itself, the infusion of the Pleroma's qualities abundance, interconnection, creative love into the very fabric of material existence. This is what the alchemists called the great work, not the literal transformation of lead into gold, but the spiritualization of matter, the recognition that the density of physical existence is not an obstacle to divine expression, but potentially its most profound medium. Think about what genuine creativity does, not the creativity of innovation labs producing new products for consumption, but creativity in the deep sense, the moment when an artist working in paint or sound or language manages to make something that did not exist before, and that, in its existence, opens a space for other humans to breathe more freely. What is happening in that moment? Something is coming through the material, through the paint, through the body, through the word that the material alone could not generate. Something is using the Demiurge's architecture as an instrument for an expression that exceeds it. This happens constantly, everywhere, in ways both dramatic and utterly quiet. It happens when a parent, exhausted after a long day, chooses patience over reaction. When a scientist sets aside the career-protecting hypothesis and follows the data toward an uncomfortable truth. When a community organizes around genuine mutual care rather than transactional exchange. When a child asks a question that none of the adults in the room know how to answer, and instead of shutting it down, someone says, "That is a beautiful question, let us sit with it." In each of these moments, the pneuma moves. Sophia's current flows through the architecture of the Demiurge, and something shifts that cannot be unshifted. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist and mystic, whose theological writings were suppressed by the Catholic Church during his lifetime and published only after his death, described matter itself as evolving toward higher consciousness. He called the convergence point the omega, a state where spirit and matter cease to be experienced as opposites and are recognized as two aspects of a single reality. He was working from within evolutionary biology and Christian mysticism simultaneously, arriving at a vision that the Gnostics, working from mythological cosmology 2,000 years earlier, had already mapped in their own language. The name changes, the direction of travel does not. And here is the recognition that ties all of this to you specifically, personally, in the life you are actually living. You have been taught to experience yourself as a recipient of reality, something that happens to you, a consciousness moving through a world that pre-exists it, that is larger than it, that operates according to rules it did not make and cannot change. This is the Demiurge's frame, and it is not entirely wrong. You are moving through structures you did not design, but it is profoundly incomplete, because what quantum physics increasingly suggests, and what every genuine contemplative tradition has always maintained, is that consciousness is not a passenger in reality. Consciousness is a participant. Not in the naive sense that positive thinking will rearrange the universe to your preferences, but in the profound sense that awareness itself, the quality of your attention, the depth of your presence, the coherence of your intention, actually affects what becomes possible in the spaces you move through. When you walk into a room genuinely grounded, not performing calm, not suppressing anxiety, but actually present with yourself, other people feel it. You do not have to say anything. Something in the field shifts. Conversations that would have been defensive become open. Solutions that would have been invisible become apparent. This is not mysticism. This is the phenomenology of presence, described by every serious contemplative tradition and increasingly investigated by researchers studying social coherence, embodied cognition, and the interpersonal neurobiology of relational presence. You are Sophia's instrument, not because you are special in the hierarchical sense, but because the pneuma, the divine spark, is actually in you, actually operative, actually affecting reality through your embodied state in ways that no algorithm can fully capture or control. And this matters urgently, because the moment in which you are alive is not an ordinary moment. Look at what is happening in your world, not through the lens of the news cycle, which by design fragments everything into isolated crises, but structurally. The hierarchical architectures of the last several centuries are visibly straining under the weight of their own contradictions. The information systems that the Demiurge's realm constructed to maintain consensus. Reality have become so accessible to so many people that the consensus itself is fracturing. Ancient wisdom traditions that were safely contained in academic or institutional contexts for generations are now in the hands of millions of individuals who are genuinely grappling with them. The ecological crisis, whatever one's political orientation toward it, is forcing a confrontation with the fundamental unsustainability of a civilization built on the premise that matter is merely resource, that the living world is merely raw material for human production. These are not simply problems. They are, from the Gnostic perspective, symptoms of a deeper energetic shift. Sophia's plan unfolding through the inevitable incoherence of a creation built on a fundamental misapprehension of what reality is. The Demiurge's structures do not fall through violence. They lose their energetic foundation as consciousness withdraws identification from them. This sounds abstract until you realize what it means concretely. Every time you choose a moment of genuine presence over compulsive distraction, you withdraw a palpable, small but real amount of energetic participation from the systems that depend on your distraction for their sustenance. Every time you choose a relationship of genuine honesty over the performance of connection, you create a space where something the Demiurge cannot manufacture becomes briefly available. Every time you make an ethical choice that costs you something in the material calculus but preserves something you cannot name but cannot betray, the pneuma moves through you and into the world. This is Sophia's distributed strategy, not a savior arriving from outside to overthrow the architecture of control, but an awakening seeded within the architecture itself, individual consciousnesses, one by one, remembering something that was never fully forgotten. The Exegesis on the Soul, a remarkable Nag Hammadi text that reads almost like a psychological case study wrapped in mythological language, describes this awakening not as passive reception but as active, agonistic engagement. The soul in this text must turn toward its own origin, must actively, deliberately reorient. And this reorientation is not a single moment of enlightenment after which everything is resolved. It is a direction, a commitment, a practice of consistently turning back, over and over, away from identification with the Demiurge's frame, with the story that this is all there is, and toward the recognition of what is prior, what is deeper, what is real in the fullest sense. This is what you are doing, palpable. When you follow a thread of genuine curiosity into ancient texts, rather than settling for the comfortable surface of what your culture already knows. This is what you are doing when you sit with a difficult emotion instead of immediately reaching for distraction. This is what you are doing when you ask, truly ask, who am I beneath everything I have been told to be? The goddess who wept in the void is not weeping now. She is watching, through your eyes, in the moments when your eyes are fully open. She is listening, through your attention, in the moments when your attention is genuinely present. She is feeling, through your heart, in the moments when your heart has not been anesthetized by the constant stimulation of a system that prefers you numb. The heaven that the Gnostics pointed toward is not a realm above the clouds waiting for the deserving dead. It is the natural state of existence when consciousness operates from its true depth, and it does not descend from above. It emerges from within, from the spark planted by Sophia in the architecture of the Demiurge's creation, waiting through all of time for the consciousness that carries it to finally, quietly, irrevocably turn around and see. You are not here to escape this world. You are here to illuminate it, not through performance, not through the accumulation of spiritual credentials, not through the announcement of your awakening to anyone who will listen, but through the quality of your presence, through the coherence of your choices, through the willingness each day to be a space where something more than the Demiurge's logic can briefly breathe. This is the secret plan. This is what was buried in the Egyptian desert and what could not ultimately stay buried. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is true in the way that only things which correspond to the deepest structure of reality can be true. The question is not whether Earth will be reclaimed. The question is whether you will remember your part in it and choose quietly to play it.
I personally researched, wrote and prepared this video to bring your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.